Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar this week. My name is Tanya, and I'm the Marketing Manager over here at Struxoft Solutions. Just before we start, for those of you who are new with us today, our principal software, MWF, which stands for Metal Wood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light gauge steel and also wood modeling. Today, however, our senior technician, Christina, will be doing something a little different today. She'll be focusing on common misuses of MWF and what actions to take to get you back on track within the software. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. At the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. In order to be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel, and please also make sure that your audio is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'll hand off to Christina now.
All right, hey everyone, good morning. Thanks, Tanya. So for today, I thought we'd cover the common misuses of MWF. So for that, we're going to look at some options when you're starting to just set up, and then we'll look at some wall split and join options. And then we'll kind of go through some general MWF tips, look at some of the options in the modular, the clash detection, multi-layer shop drawings. So we'll kind of dip our toes into a little bit of everything today and just do a broad range of some common mistakes that I've seen time and time again, just by talking to you guys on a daily basis and working through some of your projects. So the first one for general setup, and this is something that we covered a little ways back when we did our general setup for our webinar a few weeks ago. But when you're just getting set up, we generally do recommend, if you're getting a model from an architect, to purge some families. So this will start the option to purge all of your unused families. So just when you're doing this, something I want to highlight is that when you do click Purged Unused, if you already have some of your MWF data loaded in, so the markers, joins, things like that, because they might not necessarily be placed in the project, they will be included in that purge. And this is probably something you don't want to get rid of. So just something to be aware of. If you do have data loaded in, or if you're doing a purge maybe midway through the project to get rid of some things, just make sure that you uncheck all of your MWF data so it's not removed from your model. So that's just one little general tip I wanted to give about setup. I know we mentioned this a while back, so just something to keep in mind. The next one, in terms of general setup, is pretty simple, but again, just something I want to reiterate. In the previous webinar, again, where we were talking about setting up your project and getting it ready for MWF, we did mention that the wall assemblies or the wall layers, if you're using regular single layer panels, just make sure you have one structural layer between your two boundaries. So I know it's something that I repeat quite a bit, but if you are dealing with strictly single layer, you just need to have one structural layer. So again, if you're receiving a model, it's always a good idea to go through your walls beforehand and run through some of the finishes to make sure that it's set up correctly. So this is only in the case for single layer. If you are strictly using multi-layer, then it is fine to have a few different structural layers like I have here for my firewall. But generally, unless you're strictly using multi-layer, make sure you just have that single structural layer in your wall types. And the other little tips about the walls, again, a few mistakes that I've seen. Just make sure that there's no internal sweeps and reveals in the wall types. This can mess with the profile of the stud. So any kind of internal sweeps and reveals, make sure that those are removed from your wall. And then other little things in Revit that we talked about in a previous webinar. So just things like your wall geometry, make sure that your top constraint is set to the right height, because basically this is what the panel will follow for the height, the length. It just follows the Revit wall itself. So just make sure that your profile for the wall is set up correctly. The other little tips, make sure your walls are joined correctly as well. If you're using wall joins, you can reallow that join over there since it's been disconnected. But always a good idea, just make sure your joins are set up properly. And then a few other minor housekeeping things. Obviously no stacked walls to work within the software. We don't recognize stacked walls, and we also don't recognize curtain walls in MWF. So if you do have those things in the model, either acting as walls or maybe using them for openings, just make sure you replace them with Revit families. So windows, doors, or just a Revit wall opening will work as well. So a few little housekeeping things to keep in mind when you're generally getting set up. And the last one that I do just want to mention, let me go over here. If you are dealing with any kind of gable walls, you can attach it to the roof. That is completely fine. But just make sure that your top constraint is at or above the highest peak of the wall. So when you're using an interference command for clash detection, for example, the objects need to intersect the actual volume of the wall. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And also you obviously want to make sure that your studs are following the right height. So they can be attached like I have here, completely fine, but just make sure that either your top constraint is set to the right one, so that it's set to the right level, and that, or it's reflected in the unconnected height as being the correct height. So those are the main things in terms of general wall setup. For any of you guys who've used the software time and time again, you know these by now, but it's always a good thing to keep in mind. Can affect your framing later on down the line. Something's not working correctly in terms of your wall type or your openings. Chances are it's something to do with the Revit project. Okay. So the next thing I did want to bring up as well actually has to do with splits. So this I thought was a good thing to keep note of. For those of you who are using our split by rule commands or just dropping in the actual splits and not necessarily splitting the Revit wall. Depending on which way you're going about framing your panels, if you are just using the splits as is and keeping the Revit wall whole, then you'll generally want to place the joins beforehand before you even start creating the splits, and I'll explain why. So to show you guys how this works, if I go ahead and say split by rule, so I'm just dropping in some splits, and I'm just going to put in the default, so no gaps between my panels. And I'm going to split my panels with a maximum length of 10 feet. So because I don't have any join at this intersection yet, where it's going to start my 10 feet, essentially where it's going to start my panel, is at this blue dot over here. So that blue dot is the actual edge of the Revit wall, where it would be if it wasn't joined, and what we consider as the start of the wall, ergo the start of the panel. So if I start it from this side, so we're starting from the left, looking inside, so running downwards basically. I can go ahead and hit confirm, and can see that my marker was placed right here. And if I go ahead and run that dimension from the midpoint of my marker to basically that blue dot in my wall, this is where the length of the panel would be. So if I were to go ahead, run create on this, my panel would get framed technically starting from here. So this is where the joins come in. If you do want it to start at maybe the interior face where it's flush with this stud, then you'll want to go ahead and put the join in beforehand. So just to give you guys an idea, I'll throw in a model line here so we can keep this guy for reference where our old split was. And I'm going to go ahead and join my walls together. I've already got a rule set up, so I'm just going to go ahead and auto join. So now I've got my join in there. I've got my extra join member in here that it threw in. And now I'm going to go ahead and split my walls. So I'm going to run the exact same default options. I'm not changing anything. And I'll just remind you guys that that line here was the reference where I had my first split. So now you can actually see that when I place a join, my 10 feet is now actually considering the join that I have in there. So it's starting at that face of the stud, or basically when my wall would realistically start. So basically, you can see here, sorry about that, guys. So basically you can see now this dimension string, it did shift. And if I were to go ahead and quick create my walls, let's go ahead and turn on my template map. My 10-foot panel now is now considered where you'd probably want the actual wall to start if you are placing joins. So this is of course assuming that you want this exterior wall to be your main wall. The splits will reflect that if the joins are taken into consideration. So just something I do want to bring up, so you guys keep that in mind when you're first starting to place the splits and when you're first starting to join walls together. You can of course always move these joins or move these splits, sorry, and change the joins around. And you can regenerate the panels and it'll be just fine. But just a good thing to keep in mind when you are starting off, so you know your panel is the exact length that you need it to be. So that's kind of strictly for single layer. Another mistake I'll see a few times is if you guys are using multi-layer, if you're adding sheathing to these walls, it is imperative that they're regular individual Revit walls. So we can't just use this split and then run multi-layer panels. So when this kind of thing is happening, you just have to run this extra command called wall splitter after you've placed the splits. And it'll go ahead and just break it up into individual walls that you can then go ahead and frame out as multi-layer panels. So this is, again, also going to relate to the joins. Now that we've split our walls, this guy here is the shorter of the two. So when I go ahead and place my joins this time around, an auto join, this guy here will actually be considered my main wall. Since it's now the shorter of the two, you can see the arrow is going to flip and run in the other direction. So again, up to your workflow if you're using single layer or multi-layer. If you are using multi-layer, you'll probably want to place the splits beforehand, split the walls, and then run your joins if you do want it to take the shorter multi-layer wall as your main wall. So that's the main topic I wanted to broach today about the joins, and just depending on the workflow that you guys are using. And now we can move on to some general MWF tips and just a few mistakes that I've seen. So the first one, this is super simple, but always a good thing to keep in mind. Make sure your stud justification is set to your structural centerline. I know our default templates have it set to wall centerline. It just picks the first one on the list. So if you do have uneven layers around your structure, always make sure that that's set to structural centerline so your studs are in the right spot. The other thing as well, in terms of templates, is just that there are two storage options. So you can of course save it to your disk, which will have it saved to your hard drive, so directly on your computer, or you can make them project specific. So when you're saving them to your hard drive, they'll be accessible across any project that you open. But of course, if you are maybe handing off the project to one of your coworkers, they won't be able to see the templates that you've made because they are saved to your disk. So this is, again, a little bit more in terms of workflow, how you guys are going about this. If you all have access to the same templates on your disk, then by all means, save them on your disk. But generally, if you are project sharing, it's always a good idea to save the templates to be project specific, so you can send it back and forth without having to think about that. So simple, but again, just to know where those templates are saved. And where they're saved is also going to configure your template map. So for your template map, the default one that comes out of the box, if you actually look at the path here, your template map is saved directly on your C drive again. So this is for the default one. Any new one that you create after this will be project specific. So again, you can use the default one in this case for template maps, but it will just reference the templates that you have saved to your disk. Whereas if you add a new map, it'll reference the templates that you have saved to your project. So generally, if you're making your templates project specific, you're going to want to duplicate this default and create a new map entirely. And in terms of duplicating the default, that's always a good rule to keep generally if you're modifying anything that comes out of the box. So in this case, I duplicated the default template map, made one specific to the project, and I usually recommend doing the same thing for markers, for splits, basically anything in this window that we load in. If you do want to modify some openings, modify some of these markers that come out of the box, it's always a good idea to duplicate the default one that we give you, rename it, customize it, make it your own. So you're not always reusing that default, and you'll at least always have that default one to duplicate from. So it's always a good idea just to duplicate the defaults. And same thing with the splits. I have one that has a 1/2 inch gap, so I've renamed it to reflect that. And I could always reuse this default one that has no gap if I want to change it and make another gap marker. So simple stuff, but if you are using markers, just make sure to leave the defaults alone and make your own. All right. So a few other general tips for MWF, for templates. Something I'll also see time and time again is if you are maybe framing and saving templates as you go along, just make sure that you do save a template on a wall that has no connections. So the reason for that is we can see here that I do have a join on this wall. And in this case, it's not modifying the extensions, but if I were to go ahead and reset that main wall, maybe have it run the other way, there we go. So now that I've reset that main wall, you can see here that it actually affects your extensions. Excuse me. So this here is what the joins control, basically. If you are changing the main wall, changing the join around a bit, you're basically changing the extensions on either panel, and it'll create with a negative offset, and that's just how we know to pull the panel back for the join. So if you are modifying templates, saving new ones, we always recommend saving it on a wall that doesn't have any connections to it. Because just to give you guys an example, if I take this wall and I make a template out of it, so let me go ahead and use that test template. That 5.5 inch is going to be saved to my template. So on this wall with no connections, where I obviously don't want that offset, it's going to basically give me 5.5 inches at the beginning of my panel. So again, when you're saving templates, try to do it on a wall that doesn't have any connections to it. I realize that can not always be the case, or if you're working, you don't even have that in mind. But if you are saving or updating templates, double check your extensions, make sure those are set to 0. So last little tips that I want to give, and then we can move on to the modular. These again are pretty simple, but if you are using any kind of Revit edits, if you're copying and pasting, moving things around, and you regenerate, they're going to revert back to the panel. So if you are making changes with Revit, just make sure to use these edit commands to save those changes. So we do have something called an edits one now, and this will actually make things pretty simple. You can run your edits with Revit, you can move, you can copy, and then to save those in one go, just run the edits wand, and it'll save all of your edits to the panel, and it'll save them when you regen. So I know it's pretty simple, but just keep it in mind if you're running Revit edits to always follow it up with our own edit commands so they save to your panel. And really the last little tip I want to give is for the end studs. And this is something I've seen just personally a few times. If you do want to double up your end studs, you can copy paste. I know that seems pretty simple, but what I usually recommend doing is going into the panel's properties, and there is a command specific to end studs where you can double these guys up. So to give you an idea, you can grab an end stud and run modify generated, but if I go ahead and let's say triple it up, put one stud on each side, and I go ahead and refresh that, those edit commands, every time you do that, it's not taking the wall length into consideration. You're strictly kind of telling it to put one stud on each side, so it's going to go ahead and run that regardless of your wall. So now I've got this extra guy floating out in space over here. So in general, what we usually recommend is for any edits that you're trying to do, if you can do it in the panel's properties, do it in here. Anything you do in here will always keep the panel length in mind, I guess you could say. So if I want to modify end studs, I can double, triple it up as many times as I want. This guy still has my edit here, so I'll go ahead and remove that. But you can see over here that you can, again, triple it as many times as you want in end studs, and it always keeps the bounds of the wall in mind. So generally, feel free to use the Revit edits, completely fine, but just be a little cautious when you're using them. If there is a command that's specifically built for what you're trying to do, like in end studs, then we usually recommend to use those because they will keep things like the panel length in mind. All right. So that's generally what I wanted to bring up for my MWF edits. Next thing I'll just bring up, let's go to a 3D view. But just a few misuses if you guys are using the modular tool. if you're using model groups, make sure in the group itself you only have walls and openings. Don't include any panels in your model group, of course, that will be copied over. And the other thing as well is if you're using joins or markers, make sure that those aren't included in the group. So this one's a bit more critical. If I were to go ahead and let's frame out a group over here. If I were to go ahead and frame this group and manually apply markers, because I'm actually grabbing a family and applying a parameter to it, if I go ahead and apply a marker, and let's enable that, you can see here now that as I click around, it actually broke my group. So I had 4 model groups in this project before, now I only have 3. So because you're obviously applying something to the family, you're changing the group, it will break. So just something to keep in mind. If you are using markers with model groups, they do have to be applied within the panel's properties, so you're not actually applying anything to the group, so it doesn't go ahead and break. And then in terms of joins, for joins, I generally do recommend joining the walls after. This is fine, this won't break your model group, I should say. It'll regenerate the wall and add in the marker, but you're not actually changing anything to the walls. So your group will still be completely fine. And at least this way, if you do go ahead and copy onto all your identical groups, they will take on that join configuration automatically. So this also gives you a bit more wiggle room if you do want to change joins out. You can delete them, place them manually. That's generally why I don't like to make them part of the group. You can always apply them after, they don't break the group, and it gives you a bit more flexibility. And it does apply to your other groups as well. Because there's no join marker here, if you do regenerate this, guys, it'll revert back to the Revit wall lengths. It won't keep your join. But in theory, if you're modeling out one group entirely and it's done, you can copy paste, and there shouldn't even be the need to rejoin them if you do most of your changes in one group. So last 2 tips to wrap up today's webinar. I did just want to talk about clash detection briefly. So if I do want to bring in a Revit link, let's go ahead and add a new one. So when you are bringing in links for the first time, you can see here that I've got my ductwork off to the side. So you're just going to want to make sure that your shared site is always set to internal. So now if I actually go back, it's in the right spot where I need it to be. So just make sure that that's always set to internal, that you do have Revit coordinates. So if for some reason we're not picking up the clash, make sure your coordinates are linked from the model. And The only other tip I have for this is that if you are using a non-Revit file, so an IFC, a Tekla file maybe, just be sure to upload that to Revit first, save it as a Revit project, and then link it in. And it should also contain the project reference levels in here, so we're able to pick it up for the clash detection. So just two things to keep in mind for the clash. If I open it up separately, you can see that these guys are actually generic models. But my references are in here, so I know it'll be picked up when I bring it into my Revit project. And the last tip I have is just for shop drawings. So let me go ahead and generate that. So obviously, we do recommend generating shop drawings as kind of a last step process to your workflow. So it should be one of the very last things that you do. But I understand that may not always be the case. Just because if you do regenerate an adjacent wall, so if I regenerate 187, if it was created afterwards, basically if some change was made, if you go back to your shop drawing, because I regenerated an adjacent panel to it, I can now see a little bit of overlap in here. So this stud isn't part of my 184. It's actually panel 187. So it's that adjacent panel, and that can be a little confusing. You can also see it in your floor plan and in your ceiling plans. So this is generally why we do say, if you're generating shop drawings, make sure it's a last step so you don't have to maybe regenerate or edit panels that are close to it. So I realize that can't always be the case. So if this does happen, there is a refresh drawings button. You can just run this on your views. Should remove anything that isn't part of the panel that shouldn't be there. So at least you won't have to restart the drawing. But if you do want to save yourself a few clicks and having to go through each of your shop drawings just to double check them, again, good last step process is just to run your drawings last. But that's it for me today. I realize this was a lot of information, so if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. Just as she mentioned, we have time to answer a few live questions. Just to remind everyone, if you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just please also make sure that your audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, though, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session has closed. As always, please feel free to share this recording with any colleagues. All right, it looks like we have a few questions that came through. All right. Christina, we have one from Asita. Asita, I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you right now. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, hi all. I have two questions basically. One is regarding the double stud walls. So we are getting walls from client that has two structures. So are
Okay.
we need to separate those, or is it a way to make it by once?
So you can create it as one wall, and for that you do need multi-layer. So to give you an idea, if I go into multi-layer, let's go into, let's just let me find my wall type here. There we go. So I have one template basically saved to each individual layer. And
Okay.
then when you go ahead and use quick create within multi-layer, it creates one separate panel, or one entire panel, I should say, with two different rows of studs. So if you want to create this as one big panel, feel free to use multi-layer. If you want this as two separate panels, then they will have to be separate walls with individual structural layers, so it doesn't
Oh,
confuse the regular engine, I could say.
okay.
But
Fine.
multi-layer
Thank you.
to create it in one.
Okay. My next question is for circular walls. MWF is giving the errors key it's not supporting. So is there any way to do the circular walls?
Are they completely circular, or is it a radial wall?
Yes, radial wall. You can say that.
Okay. Yeah, so radial walls are something that we are going to support. I think we're going to do the update in the next release.
Okay.
So it is something that we should have updated, and it'll work in the next release.
Okay, so we probably get that. I'm using that MWF Metal Pro. So you need to add in that also, right?
Yes. So you do need Pro Metal. That's just the base software, and
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I have another question, right? Shop drawing. Can we able to do the gypsum board shop drawing also from this MWF, or means Metal Pro, or in which version we are able to do that?
Uh,
That gypsum board countings.
you're able to do it in all versions. It comes standard. So you just have to make a separate template. It's under here in the sheathing. And
Okay.
then it's the same idea for multi-layer. You just assign the
Okay.
template to that layer and hit create.
Okay. I'll try, and if not, I'll contact you. Thank you.
Yep, perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Christina, we have another question from Kamal. Oh, Kamal, are you just wondering if your audio is working correctly? It says that you cannot be unmuted. All right, I'm just gonna see if there's any other questions that came through Christina in the meantime to see if Kamal can get that sorted out. All right, I'll just give that a few more seconds. All right, Christina, I think that's a wrap for today. If there were any questions that you would like to ask, a mailer will be sent out shortly with the recording of the webinar with our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to us through there, and we'll get back to it. We'll have your answers, have the answers back to you as soon as possible. Once again, thank you, Christina, and thank you to everyone who attended the webinar. All right, we'll now be ending the webinar. Have a great day.